Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
On this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast, I had a chance to chat with Isabella Schmitt and Stephanie Mull from Proxima Clinical Research. And the topic that we dove into is conducting clinical trials during COVID. So enjoy this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host and the founder of Greenlight Guru, John Speer. And as we're talking about this, and I'm sure by the time this goes live, it's still going to be the case. We're all still, in this pandemic situation in the world. I think we're all trying to figure out specifically from a medical device industry standpoint what the impact is. I know there's been a lot of movement on the emergency use authorization. I've heard some stories from other companies that this has caused some challenges and delays, and some of the challenges and delays have been in their clinical studies, which is unfortunate because, they're developing other very meaningful products and technologies. But I think we're starting to figure out ways to navigate this. And the good news is we've got some experts joining us today on the Global Medical Device Podcast. We have Isabella Schmitt. Isabella's been a guest before. Isabella is with Proxima Clinical Research, and she is a regulatory affairs consultant. And joining her is one of her colleagues at Proxima is Stephanie Mull. Stephanie is the Director of Clinical Project Management. So ladies, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So clinical trials, this is one of your areas of domain expertise. And I guess before we dive too deep in the subject, this is current pandemic. It's caused some chaos. I got to imagine, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So a lot of the trials have been stalled, and it's hard to get sites up and running. Stephanie can probably talk to a lot of the details associated with that. But yeah, it's been crazy, especially outside the U.S. too.
Yeah.
I think we've seen that, sites have been suspending their operations of clinical trials. They're restricting visitors coming in. So CRAs can't come on site. Several of the CRAs are not traveling just for health reasons as well. Subjects aren't able to come in as well. So we're seeing a lot of issues with just sites not being able to operate normally. And then sponsors and CROs not being able to operate normally either.
Right. I guess I'm curious, are there some device spaces or products and technologies that, in your opinion, have been impacted more than others? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Usually if it's an elective thing, those are pretty impacted. They don't want, especially if it's an elective thing that's involved with the hospital, right? Because the hospitals are a bit overloaded. And a lot of medical device studies are in hospitals, university hospitals. And so they get pretty impacted with, in specific areas too, like Houston right now is a bit overloaded with cases. So it's sometimes difficult to get some of the sites up and running here. And so I'd say, across the board, I think it's been more difficult than normal, but not impossible. But elective procedures have had more of a halt to them. I don't know, Stephanie, do you have any other ones?
Yeah, we've seen that. We've had a few of our trials that have involved elective procedures that have had to be delayed for several months because the hospitals were wanting to save bed space. And so those procedures could not continue.
And Isabella, you talked about, Houston being, maybe a little bit impacted because of availability and spikes and things of that nature. You talked a little bit about the global, this is a global phenomenon that we're seeing too. Are there areas of the world where we're starting to see an increase or clinical studies pick back up? Is there anything, light at the end of the tunnel in a good way?
So I can tell you, I guess, the reverse answer to that. Not too long ago, and everything's changing so quickly.
I know, it's so fluid.
Hard to say exactly. But, not too long ago, client in Finland asked me when we would be able to run clinical trials again. This might have been maybe a month ago. And, so they're obviously we're closed for clinical trials there. And I told them, well, in the United States, we're still running the trials, and we are still running the trials. It's just in a different atmosphere here now. And I think that that's the case probably in a lot of the places that are impacted, Europe and, well, I guess, China's pretty resolved now, I think, at least. So, that impact has been kind of pretty widespread, where even if the trials are running, there are changes being made. People are moving to more remote monitoring, or virtual visits. Things like that are occurring more. And so that does make the site shift how they practice. And so that can lead to certain, complications and considerations for sponsors and also for the site.
And Stephanie, you started to share, or you shared a couple things a moment ago about some of the causes that can suspend a study. Do you mind maybe elaborating on those just a little bit?
Sure. I think the first thing is the subject safety. That's always the paramount issue in a clinical trial, whether there's COVID or not, right? We have to always make sure that whatever we're doing, the subject safety is the first thing that we're taking into consideration. So, as trials have been met with the impact of COVID, the sites and the sponsor both have to stop and take a look and say, is what my trial all about? Can I continue going forward in this environment and still ask the subject to participate and come in? And are they going to be put at risk? And so you really have to stop and evaluate all of that. And, and you have to evaluate both sides of it. Is there a risk for them coming in and contracting COVID just by being out and about, right? Or is there then an alternate safety risk of them not being seen and then continuing on without being seen in the study with their investigational product, whatever that may be. So you have to look at both sides of it. And so really have to weigh, where do I need to ensure that the subject is being safely monitored? And like Isabella was saying, that's where then because of those risks on both sides, we don't want to put the subject in undue risk by asking them to come in, but yet I can't suspend, I may not be able to, for my particular trial, suspend all visits for that subject because of the particular investigational product they're receiving. I need to follow up for safety reasons. So that's where, we really have to look at the trial and pivot with the site and look at, what can I do with the site to make sure that the subject safety is going to be of utmost importance going forward. A couple other things, just the availability of the staff. A lot of clinics had to shut down their staff, having them come in, that's also a risk to their safety. So, one of the things about starting up a clinical trial that you always have to ask is, does the PI have adequate staff to run the trial, and can he or she provide adequate oversight? And if you don't have staff any longer, then you can't fulfill that requirement. And, your staff, if you just have one or two staff left that can work on the trial, are they also adequately trained? So, there's a lot of questions you have to ask as you're determining all of the risk, and then what are the choices that you want to make for how you can continue the trial safely.
No, those are really good points. I mean, I guess, starting off this conversation, naively, I was thinking, oh, well, it sucks that I was planning to do a clinical study and then, something happens and I can't do this and it's delayed, but I totally forgot about the studies that were already in progress, right? This is creating probably a lot of concern for folks.
Yeah. And having to I guess there's also, you set up a site a study in a certain way, and a site as well. And mostly everybody wants to, going electronic is usually the way to do things now. Electronic as much as possible. You have audit trails and all that. And so it's way more controlled than if you do paper. But if you're trying to do something on a pretty lean budget, sometimes sponsors will still do paper studies. Paper studies are pretty hard if you can't go to the site to do the clinical monitoring that you normally would be able to go there. And so then you have this complication of, do you switch to electronic, and what does that look like? And then if you're switching to electronic, you have to find your EDC system, and then you have to make sure that your EDC system is Part 11 compliant, and that all the signatures are Part 11 compliant. And so you get into sort of this, like, you fall down a rabbit hole, I guess, into like all of the changes that you have to undergo, and making sure that you're still collecting and monitoring the data as much as you possibly can, because FDA still wants you to do that. And if you're deviating from either monitoring or patient visits, protocol deviations, you have to document all of those. And FDA is aware that with COVID, that'll happen more because everything's so unstable, I guess, right now. But they still want you to keep track of that, so that when you do go with your submission to FDA, they understand what happened. And if you get a site audit, that's also documented there as well. And so, with all of that documentation, that helps kind of address any variability that there might be in your data. So, if you have patient windows, often in clinical trials, patients have visit windows. And so it may be difficult for patients to get to sites in those windows. And so then you have a protocol deviation there. If it's a protocol deviation for safety, always the safety, like Stephanie was saying, of the patients is paramount. And so you make the choice to have that protocol deviation. But FDA, normally you have to get a protocol deviation approved, or not protocol deviation, but a protocol amendment approved, sorry. And so, FDA typically will want you to get that protocol amendment approved before you start executing on that amendment. So if you're changing visit windows, or you're changing from inpatient, in-person visits to virtual visits, that's something that would probably require a protocol amendment. And normally you get that approved through the IRB and all that first. But in this particular case, if it's a safety related issue, they would just want you to kind of have a deviation, and you'd start doing that, and then you have to inform them after you started. Wow. For IDEs, they want it within 5 days, but within 5 days, but they're also understanding about that. So if you can't, you have like an N of 1 on the sponsor side working on your study, it might be difficult for you to report all of the deviations and amendments and things like that within 5 days to FDA. So.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is the world that you both live in, and I guess I never thought about it. I mean, I assume protocol deviations and amendments, I mean, this happens on a normal basis, right?
Yeah, I mean, just as you're going along in the trial, deviations happen. Patients don't show up when they're supposed to. Assessments are out of window, a lot of times, and you just document it. And, if it's a minor deviation, you keep track of that. Major deviations obviously need to be reported appropriately to the IRB and sponsor. But yes, in this environment, there's a lot more deviations going on because of, just what's happening across the board with the pandemic. So, and ideally, yes, you would like to submit an amendment first to the FDA before you implement anything. But again, as Isabella said, because of subject safety, you want to make sure that you're looking at that first and implementing any changes, and then you can notify the FDA after that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, based on the two of you describing this, that the number of deviations is probably significantly higher. And what that says to me, I mean, Isabella, you mentioned EDC. I'll just elaborate. I assume that means electronic document control. But it seems to me that document control and document management is probably a core competency for anybody conducting a trial to begin with. But now this is exaggerated. This probably puts a lot more emphasis on good documentation practices.
Yeah. So it stands for electronic data capture.
Oh, see, I didn't even have it right.
But you were close. You were close. That was a good guess.
Well, I'm glad I said something then. That's good.
Just throwing out terms like everybody knows what they mean. Well, I'm the acronym girl now.
Well, it's an acronym-rich industry, and there's segments where the acronyms are different than in other segments. So I'm glad you elaborated on that. The subject visits, that seems like a really important thing, and I could speculate, but I got to imagine there's probably some best practices that you have seen and might be able to suggest to folks. How do you handle virtual visits? Any best tips or pro tips you could suggest?
Sure. Subjects can have phone visits. That would be one of the first things. That's probably one of the easiest ones to implement. And phone visits are oftentimes routine parts of clinical trials anyway, especially in maybe some long-term follow-up studies where you just want to call subjects and check on them for adverse events and any con meds, things like that. But, if you're switching from what would normally be an in-person visit to a phone visit, there might be some things that you can't accommodate, right? Like you can't check somebody's vitals while they're on the phone. So you could potentially still conduct the phone visit and ensure that the subject is safe. Are there any adverse events that are happening? You can check on them with, any of their investigational product and how that's going. But you will, like we talked about, probably have to write deviations for the things that you couldn't do because you weren't in person. Another option that we've seen sites doing is switching to virtual visits, a teledoc. So, oftentimes a lot of sites already have started to implement those just in their routine practice, not necessarily for research. So, if a site already has that up and running and they can utilize that, one thing I would just say is that switching from an in-person to a televisit does require some training. And I think we would need to document that the site does understand how to conduct a visit over video and ensuring that, there's the proper controls in place. So, you just need to think about that and how will you document the training that the staff have to ensure that they know how to conduct those visits. But those are the two types of visits that could still continue, from the site and the subject. The other types of visits that have been going remotely are your monitoring visits. And I think we've touched on that a little bit before. So we've seen, typically when you start a trial, you do a qualification visit of the site where you go on site and you check out, do they have the necessary space? Do they have the staff? You actually see the people in person. You see where they're going to store the equipment. And you can check all that out. We're not in this environment. Most of the sites are not allowing on-site outside visitors. Some are starting to, but a lot of the larger institutions still are not. And then, when you have to initiate a site and train them, oftentimes, we do that on site as well. And again, we're having to be creative and come up with ways of how we can train sites to conduct the trial appropriately, not being in person with them. We had one interesting scenario where a site had to be trained on a device. We couldn't do it in a remote fashion. They had to actually have hands-on experience with the device. And so we rented a space at a local hotel right across the street from the institution. And so the staff could come to that hotel and, maintain social distancing and wear masks and be safe, but could have that hands-on training with the device. And we could still accomplish that even though we weren't necessarily allowed onto the institution itself.
Oh, wow. Well, that sounds like you're being creative in a productive way. So good on you. Folks, I want to remind you, I'm talking to Stephanie Mull and Isabella Schmitt. Both these ladies are with Proxima Clinical Research. They do a ton of work, certainly in clinical, but also in regulatory front. I would encourage you to learn a ton more about Proxima Clinical Research by visiting their website. It's proximacro.com. Stephanie, you talked about a moment ago, like the doing some of the virtual visits, and you said something that I was curious about like vital signs, where a patient needs vital sign checks and things like that. I got to imagine a lot of patients who are in these studies, they don't have, blood pressure monitors and things of that nature. So are you seeing like those patients be issued like in-home health devices to be able to do that?
That is something that could be considered. I think a lot of the options that are out there to do, you just have to take into consideration like the time and effort that it requires to get those things procured and then shipped to sites to give to patients, and then documenting all of that change and how it's going to be managed. And so, assessing that timeline versus the timeline of COVID overall that we don't really know, and making those assessments to say, okay, we're going to do this kind of creative, innovative thing a little bit differently, but we have to make sure we document all of it. And we're changing, if we have to write up any plans or amendments for how this is going to be handled, and make sure all that's in place, and then you can move forward with it. So, yeah, I think, there's things like that. There's also, subjects could go potentially, like, if they need to get their labs and they can't go into the site, but there's a local lab that's available, they could go there to get their labs, provided that the labs are standard that would be drawn, that are available at any local lab, something like that. You could do that in an instance as well. And the FDA guidance allows for something like that. So there's things that can be done. And I think you just have to take a look at your study and the scale of your study and the number of patients impacted and the sites. And maybe not every single site has that option either. So it's a little bit of a nuance of what's available at each site, what options there are, and then looking across the study as a whole and ensuring subject safety first and foremost, but then data integrity and what's going to happen at the end of the study with the data, and thinking about that too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I know in general, the topic of human factors is a big area of focus for medical device companies. And it seems like with all of these nuances that this pandemic is causing from a clinical trial perspective, that it might even put even more emphasis on the human factors side of things. Do you have any context or anecdotes or things or tips or pointers that you might want to share with folks?
Actually, Stephanie and I had a conversation before this conversation, and one of the topics that we talked about was, it wasn't necessarily human factors, but it was just about changes to device design, regardless, of human factors or other reasons, to make them a little bit more, I'm getting to human factors, but usable in the COVID world, and what does that mean? Ease of use for different personnel, maybe, would be a human factors kind of thing, but also like the ability for remote devices, right? I think is coming to be a bit more important to like wearables, to your point about, tracking vital signs, even outside of clinical trials, just tracking vital signs, in normal clinical space is becoming really important. And, being able to do that from a safe distance is obviously better than, sticking a thermometer in someone's mouth. So I think, I don't know that I would have a specific example of someone doing something particularly interesting with human factors because of COVID, but there are a lot of pivots, not only with design, but with companies who have a device who could utilize that device for COVID, who are maybe not pivoting entirely, but they're switching their focus for a little bit to do, as you mentioned before, an EUA. So we've seen a lot of that, a lot of EUAs coming out of, especially diagnostics companies who maybe have a platform technology that they can modify a bit to be COVID related. And then, to your usability point, and just throwing this out there, but if you're doing like a home use case, that's a whole different ball game with diagnostics than it is if, you're doing a clinical case, but usability becomes really important for home use diagnostics.
Yeah, and I think I read or heard something recently where I think it's NIH has this program, and I don't have all the details behind it, so forgive me for that, but maybe this will jog some memory cells on your end. But there's some program at NIH level, and there's a significant amount of funding. My number's probably off, but it's something like $2 billion or something is being allocated to companies for, I think, some sort of COVID diagnostic test or something along those lines. Is anything that I'm saying ring a bell with either of you? Have you heard of this thing?
Is it All of Us? Is that what it's called?
I don't. Forgive me. I'll look it up. But anyway, there is a question here. I'll get to it. It triggered a thought that I think a lot of the people that are or companies that are diving into this program, some of them are new to med device, some of them are not new to med device, but just the notion of it being a diagnostic test says to me, oh, wow, there's going to be some sort of clinical component to this. It seems like, understanding how to navigate clinicals in this environment is really important. So, assuming some of those folks might be listening, do you have any key tips or pointers on what folks should do? I mean, I know they should call Proxima CRO, but aside from that, any practical advice?
Specifically for diagnostics?
Well, it doesn't have to be for diagnostics. I'm just saying in general. I mean, I know there's a lot of folks who are, jumping in to try to develop some sort of diagnostic or test or
just someone who doesn't have medical device in the past, like they're coming from a different industry.
Right.
I think the biggest thing for them to be aware of is that if they're coming from an unregulated industry, they're going to be, I've seen this, so they're going to be a little shocked about what it's like to be in a regulated industry. So beyond, I guess if they're coming from not a medical device perspective, they've never done a clinical trial before, so everything will be new to them on that front, so they won't really have any comparison to make. But clinical trials are heavily regulated, and even when you have an EUA where they tell you that your quality system is less than it is normally, and it is, you still have to have a lot of procedures in place to do complaint handling and things like that. So I would say, be aware that, taking on, and I'm not discouraging them by any means, but they should just be aware that taking on, something in the healthcare industry is a heavier lift than they may be used to in some of the other industries. And, particularly like consumer electronics and things like that. There's just a change in sort of the mentality that you have to live by in the medical product industry. And I've seen, companies coming, like you're saying, John, from, consumer electronics and aerospace, and, they're coming up with, they're typically doing more the ventilator side of things. But, a lot of people are doing face masks, which are a little bit less of a heavy lift than some of the other EUA products, but still different. And so I would just say the main thing I would say across the board, not just with clinicals, but across the board, is to be aware that there are regulations surrounding these products.
Yeah. And I'm sure the Proxima team, is more than willing to have conversations with those folks and try to give them a little bit of education of the things they should be focused on from a clinical perspective, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Stephanie, do you have anything to add to the clinical?
Yeah. I was just going to say, the only other thing I was just going to add to that is if somebody is in the process of, maybe they've already crossed over and said that, I'm ready to start a clinical trial, and they're kind of on that cusp of thinking about what they're going to do. I guess I would say that feasibility and talking to the sites at this point is really important. What one site has and the process and the procedures they have in place for how they're handling COVID and patient visits and new trials might be very different than another site, especially when it comes to academic centers versus community-based versus research standalone sites. I guess I would just encourage those folks that are going to be starting a new trial to have conversations and ask the questions of what procedures do you have in place for COVID? How are you operating right now? How are you doing patient visits? Understand what the site has for a procedure in place. And then you can get kind of a broad landscape, call 5 of your sites that you want to participate, talk to them, understand their process. What are they allowing? What are they not allowing? One of the things, and maybe we'll touch on this in a little bit, but, for remote monitoring, it's really great if a site can give you access to their EMR remotely. That makes life really easy for monitoring the data. So there's still things you have to do to cover your bases and all of that, but it's much easier if a site can transition from having, in-person monitoring visits to remote monitoring visits that they can give you access to the EMR. And so I guess I would just encourage anybody that's new out there to, again, qualify your sites, talk to them, understand where they're at, what procedures do they have in place, and how are they operating at this current time.
Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah, go ahead.
One thing I would say, and I guess this is for people who may be going into their first clinical ventures, that some of the lingo we're using may not be familiar to them, and they might not even know what monitoring means. So essentially, monitoring is when you have a qualified person, and qualified would be someone trained and who knows how to do clinical monitoring, go to a site or remotely get information from a site that looks at their quote unquote source data, which is essentially usually de-identified patient records, to see, the particular interesting things that you're collecting for the site. So usually you'll have something called a case report form where you collect a bunch of data that is relevant to your study. And you need to usually verify that information in your case report form, which can be in the form of an EDC, against the source data at the site to make sure that it's accurate. So that's one thing. And then you'll also go to the site to check for things or remotely look at the site to check for things like protocol deviations, just a patient come outside of a window that you weren't expecting. So that's all the clinical monitoring things. It's having control over the study and making sure that the study is also progressing at the pace that it should be moving along. And EMR is electronic medical records too. So that's another acronym that we threw out there. So, so I don't know if I covered all of the basics there. Stephanie, did I miss anything?
You got us. Great job.
Well, I mean, I'm speculating a little bit, or maybe I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit. Of course, none of us have any idea how long this situation is going to be, quote, the new normal. But at the same time, I mean, we know it is the current normal. So do you see this kind of shaping the future of clinical trial design? I mean, like the process behind it and how I do it. And I mean, again, I'm asking you to speculate. I know, quality and regulatory people don't like to speculate a lot of times. So I might be making you a little uncomfortable with that question.
I don't mind speculating. So I would say, and again, Stephanie, you can disagree with me on this speculation, but I would say that I think as an industry, we're trying to switch more to electronically doing things as much as possible anyway, and reducing the I guess, monitoring burden, quote unquote. So we're moving towards risk-based monitoring, and remote monitoring. And we're moving from, paper CRFs in the past to now electronic data capture systems. So I would say that we're in that shift anyway. So I would say this is just giving us a little kick in the butt to go a little bit faster with it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you, Isabella. I think, some of the areas that maybe people have kind of dipped their toe in the water in the past, and some sponsors were doing electronic things. I think we're going to see a lot more people pushing forward into being as much electronic across the board for documentation and, record keeping and things like that. Sites have to keep a regulatory file for on-site for any trial that they initiate, and that contains all of the required FDA documents and essential documents that they need. And so, oftentimes that's been in paper, and I'm seeing, a lot of sites starting to push now into having electronic ways of keeping that. So, I think not only on the site side, but on the sponsor side and the CRO side, pushing a lot more forward into as much electronic means as possible. I think doing data capture through electronic means, the EDC, electronic data capture, and electronic case report forms, I think that's been around for a good long while. And a lot of trials have been in that method. But I think some of the other ways of doing the monitoring, and keeping your records and things like that in electronic means is where we're going to see some of the changes as well. And I think we're going to see some cost savings as well in that. And, if we can complete more visits remotely and on more of a risk-based approach, you don't have to send a person to the site to check their data and monitor their data. You can do that remotely. So you save travel costs and you save the time that they're, in between. So it's, I think there's hopefully going to be some efficiency and cost savings that we'll see out of all of that.
Well, I mean, it sounded like a silver lining to me. I mean, right?
It only takes a pandemic to have a silver lining.
Well, and it's something that we've seen and heard a lot from Greenlight customers that, so much of the medical device industry across the board, regardless of functional discipline, has been probably too heavily reliant on paper, full stop. And what we've been hearing from our customers, because Greenlight, is a SaaS platform for managing design and development and quality events and document management, change management, all the things that you would fit underneath your quality management system, that Greenlight's actually enabling them to get work done in this current environment because everybody's remote. So, maybe that is the silver lining, that this is going to improve best practices, because it is a little crazy to think about in 2020 how much we as an industry still rely on paper.
That's very true.
I totally agree with that. You guys should add video conferencing to your Greenlight system, and then people could hold their CAPA meetings and stuff through the software.
Maybe like a Zoom integration or something. That's not a bad idea, actually. I'll actually log that. It's an interesting one, so I'll capture that as a feature request. But
if it starts making you billions of dollars, I want
to. We'll send you the residual. Yeah, for sure.
Heard it here.
We'll just call it the Isabella feature. We'll name it.
Yeah.
So it could be good, could be bad, but I guess that's worth the risk. All right, ladies. To kind of wrap things up today, any other key points, tips, gotchas, anything else come to mind on this topic of clinical trials during COVID that we haven't talked about today that you think is really important to share?
I would just say that whatever you do to change things to respond to COVID in your trial, especially if you're in the midst of the trial, is that you document it. And that's the big thing in our industry is, if it's not documented, it wasn't done. And so I think, whether it's a deviation after the fact or, updating your plans that govern how you're going to run the trial, your monitoring plan, your project management plan, your communication plan, your whatever plan you might have for the trial, making sure that they're updated with all of the changes that you're making, again, protocol updates, all of that, and that you're documenting what you're doing to protect the subjects and, continue to move your trial forward.
All right, that's great.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. The other thing that I would say is if this is your first foray into a regulated industry like this, I would get help. I wouldn't try to do everything myself because regulated industries are regulated. And so you want to make sure that you're compliant with the things that you're doing. Even if you're trying to run it yourself, I would at least get some advisors to help you out.
Great tips. And folks, one of the best in the business is the Proxima clinical research team. You can, again, find out more about them. Go to Proxima, Proximacro.com. And I want to thank Stephanie Mull and Isabella Schmitt for being my guests on the Global Medical Device Podcast. I mentioned it briefly a moment ago. Greenlight Guru, we're here to help. We are the only medical device quality management system on the market today that's designed exclusively and only for the medical device industry, designed by actual medical device professionals. So, if you need a little bit of help with document management, setting up your quality system, capturing your design and development activities, the risk associated with all of these things are important if you're going to be entering into any sort of clinical trial of any way, shape, or form, in addition to just being a medical device company. These are expected behaviors and best practices. I would encourage you to go to www.greenlight.guru to learn a whole bunch more about the only medical device QMS on the market today. As always, thank you for being a loyal listener of the number one podcast in the medical device industry, the Global Medical Device Podcast. Share the word with your friends and colleagues, and be sure to tune in again real soon for another episode. As always, this is your host and founder at Greenlight Guru, John Speer, and you have been listening to the Global Medical Device Podcast.